We'll have a look here at some of the vector operation nodes. All pretty simple, to be honest with you, so let's take a peek. First off, a good few of these really have to do with vector scales, or their lengths. Such as, first off, the normalize node. Normalize will take any vector and basically clamp it to have a length of 1. So here I've got the position for the light, which is -2 to -2, and if I plug it into normalize, you'll see that it just comes out at 0.58, 0.58, 0.58, which is of course off in the same direction, but normalized to a length of 1. I would imagine that perhaps some of you who might be newer to vectors, who've of course seen this before for a unit vector, might wonder why it's 0.58 and not 111. It is of course because it is the length of the vector between the point and the origin from which the vector is drawn. And if the item were at coordinates 111, the vector length would be greater than 1, which is what our length node does, which kind of brings us on to the length node, because that tells us how long a vector is. So for instance, here I've got my light at, -2, 2, -2, well 2, 2, 2, whatever. If I plug the result into the scalar input here, because of course we're not outputting a vector anymore, we're just outputting its length, we see that it's 3.64. what have you. The vector is kind of like the hypotenuse, and whereas in Pythagoras a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, same thing works in 3D. X squared plus y squared plus z squared equals the square of the vector length. So basically that's what your little length node here is doing. X squared plus y squared plus z squared, and take a square root of the result of that, and that's your vector length. Scale will allow us to take a vector as a direction, as it were, and scale it up or down. So for instance, we already know that the length of this vector is 3.46 whatnot. I can plump that in there, and in scale, or just using a scalar input node, I can input the scale. However, do note it is as a percentage. So if I leave it at 100% and go plump that back through length again, you see that I'm still getting the original length here. So you can only tell it to go to a percentage of its current length. If you were wanting to set a specific length for it, then probably the easiest way is just to normalize your vector first, and then obviously at scale 100% or 1 you get scale 1. So you can then just pipe in whatever scalar you want, like 2.3 or 230%. So there you go, that lets you rescale. Distance, very simple, gives you a length, but lets you set the target and origin points. So here, taking the position, so where I've done these things here, taking the position of the light, I have of course only got its position relative to its origin, which in this case is the world origin, but would be its parent, of course, its coordinates from its parent, were it part of a hierarchy. But I can do something different, such as grab the camera and take the position from the light to the camera and get a result for that, and find that distance as well. Add scaled is basically identical to the scale node, except you can add two vectors together, which of course in this case for the camera and light is -2, 2 and -7, because of course the camera is at -5 on the Z there, so that's all that's being added on, since it's at 0 on both x and y. But this new vector of course has its own length, and this vector position of course would be up and back here somewhere at -2 to -7 position to origin. But again, I can scale that via a percentage in the same way as the scale node. Subtract scaled basically subtracts one vector from another and lets you scale it. HPB add, this is for adding rotational vectors to one another. If I grab the camera here and just sort of spin it around somewhere, then I can grab the camera's rotation and also the light's rotation there and take a peek at that result, basically adding up two different rotation values onto one another. The reason that we use the HPB add is because you will get a different result to a regular add. If I take the same two outputs there, rotation for each, and we plug that into vector, you see we get a different result there, but only in the heading and bank channels, or the X and Z. This is down to Lightwave's rotation order, of course, and the fact that it uses Euler coordinates to process rotations. Hence, you can't just add them up verbatim in the same way as you do positional coordinates. They have to be done in order. This is why we have the HPB add. You may notice that we don't have things such as HPB multiply, HPB subtract and similar. They would be helpful, I must say, doing certain things with vectors, most specifically motion control. You can, however, construct them for yourself out of matrices if need be. But if you do find yourself in a place to subtract rotations, do know that the subtract node will give you a essentially erroneous result. Or rather, it will give you the correct result, but having been processed the wrong way, so not the result you wanted. Lastly, the transform node. This is for changing the vector between coordinate spaces, exchanging object coordinates for world coordinates, or world for object, where need be. Note, however, that this node is really used for surfaces, so you use it when texturing, or when outside of texturing, usually alongside something like the spot info that has surface vectors. What it does not do is convert regular positions and rotations. You cannot, for instance, take a position here, -2 to -2, and transform it. See, object to world or world to object, they should be the same in this space. So if this node were transforming the vector, then you'd still expect to have exactly the same -2 to -2 result. But you don't. Only for surface space, essentially. And there we go. These are our common vector op nodes.